Welcome to the next video in Unreal Engine. This video is going to be covering the input system and how we can set it up with our player to make our player move, look around, and jump. This is the second video in the beginner series. You should have watched the last video to see where we are now, where we have a player that when we press start we can't move around or do anything. So what we're going to be doing in this video is using the enhanced input system from Unreal Engine. If you go to edit and plugins and you type in enhanced, you can see enhanced input is already checked, and that's because I'm using Unreal Engine 5.1. If you're using an earlier version, this will not be on by default and you would have to check it. There is one problem though, is it doesn't really convert nicely with the old input system. So if you go down here to input, you have action and axis mappings. These are the old input system. The new one is a completely different system on how to set it up, but it works a lot nicer once you know how to use it. So if you do choose to convert it or you want to use an earlier version, make sure you click that checkbox and restart the engine. And once you come here to input, you want to go down to the default player input class and change these to the enhanced input versions. So once we have that, I'm going to press Ctrl space to bring up the content browser. I'm going to right click, create a new folder called blueprints. And I'm just going to move the game mode base and a character we made into the blueprints. I'm going to right click, make a new folder called input, and this is where all of the input for our game is going to go. So I'm going to right click and make another folder called default. We want our player to have some default input that we can override later, but this is the default that we need to add. So if you right click and go to the input drop down and click input action, call this IA_move. And when we open this, you can see we get a menu, something like this. All this is doing is telling us what this input action is going to have. Will it consume the input? Will it trigger when paused? Reserve all mapping? Stuff like that. All we are really worried about is the value type. We want to change this to a vector 2D. This is basically a 2D vector, so only X and Y elements. It doesn't have the Z element too. And this is going to allow us to do the W, X, Y, and Z movements as well as the mouse delta with the look input. So you can save this and you want to make sure consume input is checked. What this is basically saying is if we have multiple input actions, will this one stop all of the other actions that go after move with this key binding? And we want that to be true, because if we have an input action for E that opens the inventory, but you have another action E which is enter a car, if you're entering the car you don't want to open the inventory at the same time. So that's why you check consume input. I'm going to press Ctrl D and call this IA_look. And this will have also a vector 2D. It will be set to default because we duplicated it. I'm going to press Ctrl D and call this IA_jump. And we need to actually go into it and change it back to a digital bool. That's just if we press a key. So press Ctrl space again, go to input, and now make an input mapping context. This is basically allowing us to add these 3 input actions to this certain context. So I'm going to call this IMC_default. And if we we double click to open it, you can see mappings. If we open the mappings tab, we can see a drop down. Select the IA_move. Click on this keyboard and press W. Then click the plus sign. Click on it again and press S. And do this for A and D as well. Now we're not done yet. On W, we need to add a modifier, and this needs to be swivel input axis. This will basically take the X axis and switch it to Y. And you need to make sure that it's called YXZ. So it swaps X and Y axis. Basically, how the input system works, everything by default is on the X axis, and W needs to be on the Y axis for this move to be 2D vector. And we also need to have W on a separate axis than the A and D so we can move forward and backwards. So the S key is also going to have the same, but it's going to have one more. It's going to have the negate. We want to switch all of the values to negative. The A key is just going to have a negate modifier because there's already going to be an X axis by default. The D key we can leave alone. That's the IA move done. We can save that. Now click the plus sign at the mappings and add the IA_look. Just type in here mouse, and you can see X, Y, 2D axis. That's what we want. But we want a modifier too. So go ahead and add the negate modifier and make sure only Y is checked. That will invert the mouse so that it works properly like normally the games are. And add another input for the jump. And this one is just going to be space. You can add multiple mappings for jump. This can be the gamepad if you want to support gamepad. I'm not going to right now, so I'm not going to add that as a mapping. Now you can close this. That's great. Now we have input, but how do we add it to our player? So if we go to our blueprints and we go to our character, this is where we will add the input. So if you get a menu like this, just open a full blueprint editor. Now I'll just drag this to the main window. So on begin play is what we're going to be focusing on, so we can actually just take all of that out. So what we can do here is we can get our player controller. And we don't really have our own player controller set up. So what we're going to do is set up our own player controller quickly, because it's useful to have our own to manage stuff like respawning the player. So if we right click in the blueprints tab, just go new blueprint class and make a player controller and call this BP_tutorial player controller. And then open the game mode quickly, and where it says player controller class, change it to ours. It will all still behave the exact same. So in the player controller, we want to cast to BP tutorial player controller. And we want to promote this to a variable. So we can right click promote to variable, and we can just call this the player controller. And we can compile and save. And this will basically make sure every time we start the game, we will get our player controller. That's good. Now let's add this into a sequence so that we can do a little bit different stuff as well. So if we make a sequence right here, and this is basically the same as writing different lines of code, but we're just sorting it nicely. So compile and save. So the next thing we want to do is use this controller, and because this is going to fire first, we get the controller first and now we use it. So we want to get the enhanced input local player subsystem. This is going to allow us to add those input mappings. So I'm going to drag off this and click add or type add mapping context. And now I'm going to drag this back to the sequence that says then 1. So the mapping context we want to add is the default and priority is 0. So what does this mean? This is basically going to say we have this input that we just created and it has all of these key bindings. So it's going to add that mapping context to this character controller. And this controller can propagate the input to the player. So if I right click here and I do IA_move, whenever I add this mapping context, this move can be used. If I had an ability, say a gravity gun, that can pick up items, I can still declare the input method in the player, but only once the context is added, I can use it. And priority just means the lower the number, the longer it's going to take to be called. So if you set this priority to 0 and you add another one with priority 1, if your input action says consume input, it won't go to the next one. If it does say consume input or it's unchecked, then it's going to first fire the first one, which is higher priority, and then go down to the second one. And that's why we set consume input to true, so that it won't go to the ones below it. It just makes it easier to manage. So that's our input added. Let's do our movement now. So for movement untriggered is whenever we press the key, we want to add a movement input. I'm first going to right click on this action value and call split struct pin. So we get the X and Y values. So I'm going to type add movement input. And now this is asking for direction. Which direction do we want to add this movement input to? Drag off the road direction and just type the forward vector. And it's the get actor forward vector under the transformation tab. Once you click that, drag the Y value into the scale. And that's our first one done. So add another movement input. And this one is going to be the right vector. Get actor right vector under transformation. And also drag the X scale in there, so we can compile and save. So we can click play and our character can move around, but we can't move the mouse or jump. And there's one problem. There's a camera, but our player doesn't have a camera. So let's change that quickly. Add a spring arm component, which is just called spring arm, and then add a camera under that spring arm. This is useful because we can control stuff like camera delay, more things that the camera can do. Set the target arm length to 0 in the spring arm on the right side under the details panel, and go to camera settings and click use pawn control rotation. Compile and save. I'm going to move the spring arm just up a bit so that it's about at the eye height that the character would be. So now when we click play, we have our actual own camera and it doesn't auto default add a camera for us. So in the event graph, let's do the camera movement now. So type IA_look. So whenever this look is triggered, we want to do some stuff. I'm going to right click and split this as well. I'm going to add the pitch input, add controller pitch input under the pawn and input section. And we just want to put the Y value. So the Y value is when you mouse, you move it up or down. And this is going to add pitch because pitch is on the X axis. And if we look here, in this case, it will be on the Y axis, but the camera will rotate like this. As you can see, it shows the pitch is -10 right now, and that's what we want. So now what we want to do is add the yaw input because yaw is on the Z axis, which is facing upwards. So add yaw input. So we can drag that into the X value. Now we can save this and we can play, and now we can move our mouse around and move the character. Now you'll notice if you move and turn at the same time, it's a little bit glitchy sometimes. That's just Unreal Engine. If you right click or click these three dots up here and go to standalone game, and you wait for it to start up a standalone game, you will notice that it's not buggy at all. So we will just wait for this, and the standalone game starts pretty fast because this is a pretty empty project. You can see it's not buggy at all anymore. That's just how Unreal Engine works in the editor. So you can either live with that for now, or you can run a standalone game. I would just use it in the editor for quick prototyping, but once you want to test actual stuff and the glitchiness is a problem, then you can run in standalone. So now let's do the jumping. So we can do IA_jump. So what do we need to do in here? Well, on triggered we want to jump, and there's a built-in method for that. But on completed we want to stop jumping. And this is good for animation stuff. And you can also subscribe to events. So that's why you want stop jumping. And we don't need the input action value because these will only be called. This is an event-based input system, which is good. So just organize code a bit here. So let's go through what I just did in this video, and then you can see everything working. So on begin play is called when I click this play button. First, what it's going to do is get the controller that this player character owns. If we don't give it a controller, it gets a default one by itself. But the reason we cast it to a BP_tutorial player character, the one we made, is so we can add more functionality into our own player controller that we can change later on, like user interface or respawning a player or saving the game. And then we just set this as a variable. A variable basically holds a value that you can reuse at separate times, so we don't have to write this code out all the time. After the first part of the sequence is fired, we go to the next part. This is going to get the enhanced input local player subsystem, and we can add a mapping context. This will basically say, take the input we created at the start of the video and add it with priority 0. Higher priority gets priority first. And now what we're doing is we're just implementing the input methods. So whenever we have this input mapping context and we click IA_move, we trigger it, it's going to add a movement input. And then we just give it the values we want to get with it. Same with IA_look and the jump. So now if I click save, we can move, we can jump, and our input works. That's all for this video. It was a little bit longer, but there's a lot to explain for input systems and how they work, and now you can set them up with your character. I hope it helps, and in the next video we can cover some other stuff like adding different input mapping contexts at runtime.